Aloha and welcome to an afternoon with the author, where we invite authors from across the state and nation to come on and talk a little bit more about the personal journey behind their work. Good afternoon. My name is Deidre Teagarden. I'm the Executive Director here at the Nisei Veterans Memorial Center on Maui, where our mission is to inspire people to find the hero within themselves through the legacy of our Nisei veterans. And if you want to find out more information about our center, you can do so on the web at nvmc.org. As always, we're so thrilled to have all of you join us today and a couple of new faces as well, so welcome. We're here today with John Tateishi and his book, Redress, the inside story of the successful campaign for Japanese American reparations. I will introduce John in just a minute, but want to go through a quick couple of housekeeping items. Number one, a big mahalo to one of our mainland supporters, Mr. Larry Oda. I know he's on the call today. He was able to facilitate this partnership between us and Mr. Tateishi. So Larry, thank you so much for doing that. As always, we love taking your questions. So feel free to write your questions in as they come to you by filling out the little question and answer box at the bottom left of your screen. We will get to as many as possible before the end of the talk. This is being recorded and will be available on our Nisei Veterans Memorial Center YouTube channel in about a week. So we encourage you to check out the YouTube channel for this and other talks. And as always, we couldn't do it without our sponsors. So you saw their logos as you were joining the call today. So a big mahalo to all of them. It now gives me a great privilege to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Mr. John Tateishi. John Tateishi was almost 3 years old when he and his family were forcibly removed from their home in Los Angeles and imprisoned at Manzanar internment camp for a period of approximately 3 years. Later, as the newly appointed chair of the Japanese American Citizens League's National Committee for Redress, John launched the JACL's Redress campaign in 1978 from the Salt Lake City Convention and initially directed a public affairs campaign to educate the American public about the World War II incarceration. A central strategy of that effort was the Commission on Wartime Relocation and the Internment of Civilians, which gave voice to Japanese Americans for the first time and broke a 35-year silence. The Commission's report was a clear indictment of the government's wartime treatment of Japanese Americans, and its recommendations served as the basis of the JACL's legislative drive for redress. As the Commission began its hearings, Tateishi resigned his teaching tenure to serve full-time as the JACL's National Redress Director and became the JACL's principal redress lobbyist in Washington, D.C. He served in that position until 1986, 2 years before the campaign ultimately culminated with the signing of the Civil Liberties Act. 10 years later, as the JACL's National Director, he brought the JACL onto the national stage after 9/11 as an important national voice challenging the Bush administration's policies that targeted Arab and Muslim communities and undermined the civil liberties of all Americans. He was a senior fellow at the UCLA School of Public Policy and Social Research for the 2001 and 2002 academic year, and is a former trustee of UC Merced, the newest campus of the University of California. He is the 2007 recipient of the Alice and Clifford Splendlove Prize on Social Justice. Please help me welcome Mr. John Tateishi. John, welcome.
All right, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for taking your time this afternoon to spend an hour with us. I can't imagine that we can get through a lifetime of work in 45 minutes, but we're certainly going to give it the good old American try. But I want to start off, one of the things that you wrote in the preface of your book, and one of the things that you shared with me initially was that, this is not a manuscript, this book. It is a record. And, for those who've read the book or who are reading it, that's such an important point to go in with. Why did you make that, why did you really make that point over and over in the book and then in your conversations?
Well, this came about at the urging of Daniel Inouye, who I'd gotten to know during the Redress campaign. And it was after the campaign had successfully finished, and I was still going to Washington, and I would run into him. And he said to me at one point, you need to write a record of the campaign. It was such an incredible campaign. No one would understand what it took to get this done. And and he said, you're the only one who knows how this happened, and you need to write that record. I thought he was telling me to write a book, and I said, no, I'm not interested. And every time I'd see him, he'd bug me about it. And finally, I realized, we were having a conversation, I realized what he wanted me to do was record the campaign from beginning to end at least until I left it, and what happened after, as a record of the entire process. And so I decided I would do that. And that record, that manuscript, turned into what is now the book. There were a lot of things I took out, and I wanted it to be a chronological record of what happened, and not just what happened, but how things happened, and the kinds of obstacles we had to face in getting to where we were.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll talk about that as we go along, but it's very personal, and you are very honest about the obstacles, as you say. So thank you for doing it, and it's such an incredible record. But just to start off, for those who might not have a really good understanding of what the redress or the reparations are, could you give a really quick 101 on what this was, and where this came from?
Okay, in California, the Chinese immigrants were the first Asians to immigrate to the United States. That was for the gold mines and the railroads that were being built. And about 40 years following the Chinese immigration to the US, Japanese started arriving first in Hawaii and then on the mainland. And the Japanese were different because they were farmers. They were looking for land. And like the Chinese before them, they encountered a lot of hostility and discrimination. And the political voices of California wanted to get rid of its Japanese population, but couldn't do it legally or constitutionally. And then when Pearl Harbor was attacked in 1941, that was a perfect rationale for what the government had wanted to do but couldn't do. And so they devised this whole theory that Japanese Americans could not be trusted because there could be spies among them. Although there was no record of that, and all the intelligence services of the government had already investigated the community, saying there was no problem, they're not a danger. But still, we were forced to leave our homes and were put into these concentration camps, 10 camps around the country. We were stripped of all of our constitutional rights and protections. And we spent the war years in these camps. And when the war was over, every family got $25 and told they had to leave. And so we returned to the West Coast. What happened as a result of that is that the Nisei had difficulty in trying to deal with that whole issue of what had happened to them, because suddenly, with this incredible belief they had in democracy and their pride in their citizenship, suddenly they were labeled traitors to the United States. It was devastating for them, and such a painful experience that they stopped talking about it. They would not talk about camp. And, as kids, those of us who were in camp, after the war, we talked all the time. It was how we sorted out the thinking and how we rationalized things for ourselves. But we talked about camp. So that was our catharsis. The Nisei never got that. They could not talk about camp. And it eventually became like a disability for them. So what happened was they didn't tell their children born after the war about what had happened to them. And their children grew up, went to college, and in the 60s started hearing from in their American history classes about these camps that Japanese Americans had been in. And they called their parents and asked what that was about. And slowly it turned into a need for honesty, a truth telling. The JACL in 1970 picked up that need and established reparations as a primary goal of the organization. And from there, it developed into a campaign that was focused on our loss of constitutional rights. And we carried the campaign on behalf of the community. That, in a nutshell, is what it was about. The linchpin for all of this is that the government never once was able to produce any document that stated that we had been involved in anything that betrayed the United States safety. So we said, okay, we are going to challenge that.
And you did it successfully. So talking a little bit about you and your journey into all of this, you were not initially a member of JACL. Initially, you were saying you didn't know if it was going to be progressive enough for you. And then you and your wife turned out to be charter members, correct, of your JACL chapter. Yeah. So what made the change? What made you?
I grew up under a Kibe father, and if you know anything about the history of the Kibe on the mainland, there was a distance between the Kibe and the Nisei. The JACL was literally only Nisei. They would not allow even the Issei to join. So it was a Nisei organization, and the goal of the mission of the JACL was to challenge any discriminatory statutes against Japanese Americans or Asian Americans that limited our rights, either in cities or states or the federal government. The Kibe were outside of the JACL and never really got along with the Nisei. There was always this kind of edge between them. And when the war broke out and we were put into these camps, the JACL was given the job of creating the infrastructure in the camps. And so they assigned the jobs, and the worst jobs went to the Kibe purposely. It was punishment for not being Nisei, essentially. And so the agitation really grew between the Kibe and the JACL during the war in these camps, to the point that there was a riot in Manzanar where my family was, and the Kibe were out to kill the JACL leadership. I mean, they stated that that was what they were doing. And so after the war, there was a separate path taken by each group. And as a son of a Kibe, I never really was interested in the JACL. And my father didn't dislike it as much as wonder at why the Nisei, the JACL, was so obsequious to white authority. And he couldn't understand that. So he had no use for the JACL. Well, as a son of a Kibe, that's how I grew up. And as events occurred, my wife and I had lived in England for 3 years. And after I finished graduate school, the studying I was doing, we went to England. We were there for 3 years, came back to the Bay Area, and ended up living in Marin County, which was about 90% white, 99% white. We were looking for the Japanese community. There was a Buddhist church here, so we knew there was a community. We just couldn't find it. And one day there was a notice in the paper saying there was this organization being formed. My wife's father was a very active and kind of an important member of the JACL. And so she wanted to go to this meeting. I said, you go, I'll stay home with the kids. And so the day that this meeting was going to take place, our son got sick, so my wife stayed home. Kids don't want the father when they're sick. They want mommy. So she stayed home. I went to this meeting, basically challenged the premise for what was being talked about. Ended up being on the steering committee that formed the chapter, and my wife and I were founding members of the Marin County chapter. So I became a member of the organization. And then, my interest was this thing they were talking about, this reparations issue. And one thing led to another, and I got involved. And by 1978, I was the national chair for the JACL's Redress Committee.
And you were 38 years old at the time, correct?
Yes.
I mean, so you were young. That's young to be.
Well, by Nisei standards, I was a kid. I mean, people would say, why are they giving this to a kid? He doesn't know anything. But, I felt like I knew the key to what we had to do. I was just young enough and arrogant enough to think there's been 8 years of debate and conversation in the JSL, and we haven't gotten to where we need to get. And I know how we can do that. I understand what we have to do to get there. And so I was appointed, in circumstances, I was appointed to chair the National JSL Redress Committee at 38. And I was seen as too young to do this.
Yeah. And, one of the things that you write about in the book a lot is about your father. And I think at one point, or many points throughout your life, you said that your father said, if you ever have the opportunity to do something about internment, do it. How much did that have weigh on your decision to accept this position at the age of 38?
I don't know if I was that different from my brothers, but I used to really listen to the wisdom my father gave us. And the things he talked about, our obligations as Japanese Americans to the family, to the community. And camp always bothered me. I used to have, I don't know if they were nightmares, but the image of the towers, the guard towers, stayed with me for a long, long time. And so I grew up with this sense of camp, always part of me. And he said, and I remembered he had said, if you ever have the opportunity, it's your obligation to do this, not just for the family, but for the community and for the country. And he was saying, we need to make this right. And so when that opportunity presented itself, I remembered my father's guidance on this, and I said, I thought I'll do this.
Yeah. And as you're talking about this too, this was a constitutional fight, not only for the terrible things that happened to the Japanese Americans during the war, but you talk about this fight was for the future of the nation, for all of America. And you state that in the book a lot, and it was a part of a lot of the meetings that you held. Is that correct?
One thing that was interesting as sort of my evolution as part of the JACL was I thought the organization's idealism was kind of hokey. My political education was at Berkeley in the 1960s, and I saw politics in a very different way than the Nisei and the JACL did. And the motto of the JACL was and has always been and continues to be better Americans in a greater America. When I first saw that, I thought, oh my God, I can't be part of this. But over time, I realized what they were talking about, what the JACL was talking about, was our place in this country. That by doing what we could as Americans, we would make this a better country. And that's how we find our place here. For me, the idea of redress, the idea of fighting for what we lost during the war, had nothing to do with imprisonment or our lost property or, the personal pain that any of us felt. It was about our rights as American. And I really felt like I would do what I could to vindicate the JACL Nisei's belief in this country, and also to vindicate them for their sense of having lost their honor because of our imprisonment. So yeah, that became sort of a part of my thinking, is that this was really for the country. We're not doing this for us. And I would tell audiences that over and over, that this isn't for us to regain anything, but this is really to build a stronger foundation for the country in the future, should something like this ever happen again. And I said it enough times that I really did believe it. And, I think because I did, that's why I was able to stay with it so long.
Right, and you stayed with it for a long time. So let's talk about the campaign, and it wasn't necessarily embraced right away by JECL and all the members. There was some grappling there, but the beloved Senator Inouye was very key to helping to push this along. And I know you want to talk about the senator, and I know some of his ideas really were at the foundation of this. So you want to talk about the commission and Senator Inouye and
Yeah, we thought about it. I had a committee that was a very select committee. In the JSL, you create committees democratically, one representative from each of what were then the 8 different districts. And now I saw, my feeling was, the hell with that. I'm going to pick people who've been active on this issue. So I had a committee of 5 people, and they were basically all West Coast people: Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Seattle. And we met at the end of 1978, when I was still a fairly new chair. And I said, we need to decide how we're going to approach this, either legislatively or through the courts. And we thought the courts were the best way to do this, but I really wanted a legislative fight. And I said, it was the Congress that did this to us, and we need to go after the Congress. We need the American public to know what happened to us. So that was the course we had chosen. And we started talking about, we would design a bill this way and that way. And this one member, a guy named Ray Okumura, who lives in Berkeley, said, wait a minute, we don't even know if the Japanese American members are going to support this. We knew that Norm Mineta would, because he was an active JSL member and would chide the national board for being too shy about reparations, and tried to push the organization. But here we had the 2 most important people in our milieu of politics, Danny Inouye and Spark Matsunaga, who were from Hawaii, didn't go through this and this experience of World War II the way we did, the imprisonment. Had no idea, because there were rumors that, Inouye and Matsunaga aren't going to go for this. They don't care about reparations. So we asked for a meeting. Bob Matsui had just been elected to the Congress. So there were now 4 members, Inouye, Matsunaga, Mineta, and now Matsui. And we asked for a meeting with the 4. We went to the meeting, presented our proposal, which was a direct compensation bill. We would, the feeling was, well, we may not win, but, it'll be an honest fight. We'll charge the hill and see what we could do and go as far as we can. And so we had this meeting, and it was at that meeting that Danny Inouye asked us, have you guys ever thought about a commission? And my heart dropped when he said that, because, when Danny Inouye suggests something, you don't just say, oh, that's silly, we're not going to do that. So we were all very polite and let him have his say. And what he said was, all my colleagues in the Senate, save for a few of them, really think what happened to you was justified. It was the right action. It would be hard to get them to vote. I would push for as many, and Sparky would push for as many to support this, but our numbers are going to be really small. And he looked at Mineta and he said, and Norm, how many people can you get on a bill, a direct money bill? And Mineta sort of hemmed and hawed and talked his way around it. And Inouye said, look, what you need to do is educate the public, which was my whole strategy to begin with. I thought, wow, that's really great if this will work. And he said that, you need to do certain things to make sure it works. And he said, so you form this select commission and you hold hearings in the community. Let the community speak. And that was the other part of what I was trying to figure out. How do you break this silence? By that point, we'd had 30 years of absolute silence from the Nisei. And so he said, you do this so it gets more publicity than the JSL can ever pay for by the work of the commission and these hearings. You have hearings in the community. The commission comes out with a report, and then they issue a recommendation. And part of the recommendation will be your redress bill. That's your bill that will come out of that recommendation. Mineta originally said, oh, the hell with that, Dan. We can do better. And let's go with a money bill. And a few days later, I got a call from our Washington rep who says, Mineta has changed his position. He thinks we should do this. And I had a private conversation with Inoue after that meeting. And he asked me if I was confident about the evidence. He says, because what you're going to do is leave it to this commission to determine whether it was justified to have imprisoned you or not. And if not, then they will come out with recommendations as remedies. And I said that there's no way, if you look at the documentation in the government's files, that you could come out with any other conclusion than it was wrong. It never should have happened. And so the JSL chose that as our strategy. We had a vote on it in my committee, and the committee voted to recommend this approach to the national board. And it was a very close vote on the national board. It was a very heated, I was going to say debate. It was a very heated argument that went on between board members, but the board agreed to follow this recommendation. As soon as we made the decision, the community reaction was overwhelming.
Right, and so you have this commission based on having, like you said, the Nisei come and testify, this quiet group of individuals who, don't want to shame the family and all of that.
Yeah.
And how sure were you that people would come out?
It really was a roll of the dice. I had accepted that this was the only way we were going to get anywhere, because it was everything was stacked against us. And don't forget that at this point, the US and Japan were in a vicious trade war, and the US economy was crumbling. So there was a real buildup of anti-Japanese sentiment in this country. And we, being Japanese Americans, took a lot of that heat. And people would say, well, it's your cars that are losing jobs for us, and it's your television, all of that. And so the timing was not good, but there had to be a way to get to the Congress and have them, to educate them and get them to vote on some kind of legislation. This was probably the only vehicle that would allow us to do this. None of us on the committee liked this strategy, but we realized this was the reality we were facing. Plus, it had all those other benefits, and it turned out that it would be overwhelming in the way the commission publicized everything. For me, the real question always was, will the Nisei talk? I was very fearful that this is going to fall flat on its face, because if the Nisei refused to testify, it was over.
Yeah, and, but what happened?
Well, what was interesting is it was overwhelming how many people wanted to testify. I mean, as soon as the schedule came out, the hearings in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago, we were flooded with not requests, demands that they be allowed to testify, to the point that the commission had to develop a secondary way of receiving testimony, saying, you can write your testimony if you don't testify. I mean, there was only so much time for witnesses to testify at hearings. So what was originally a 2-day stop in each city ended up being 3 full days. And witnesses only had 3 minutes to present their testimonies. And it was incredible how many were willing to share the kind of pain they felt. It was, I've said this over a lot of times now, that it was the only time I have ever seen Nisei men cry in public. There's this thing about Japanese stoicism and a lot of the stereotype, but it's true. There is this kind of stoic sense to being male Japanese. You do not cry in public. And even as a kid, I knew you don't cry in public. And what kid doesn't cry in public? But, that was ingrained in us. And for me to sit there and listen to the testimonies one after another, and excuse me, just about every witness broke down crying, and all the men some of them were up there sobbing. It was really painful and difficult to watch.
And you went to all of the meetings, and that must have just weighed so heavy on you at the same time, knowing that this was cathartic for so many people also being able to share their stories. But that must have been hard to go home every day.
It was gut-wrenching. I mean, I felt responsible because this is where I had essentially guided my committee on its decision. And so I felt responsible for this strategy, and I thought it's my obligation. I need to go to all the hearings. I sat through virtually all 3, 6, 9, 12 days of hearings stateside. And it was hard to take, but it was something I had to do. And all the stories were similar. There were variations on the same thing. The theme was that my rights were taken away from me, and who I am as an American today is a result of that. And the demand for some sense of vindication and some sense of belonging here in this country. And but mothers talked about losing their sons in the war, and fathers about all these other things they had to deal with. And it was a very painful period for us, but ultimately it served a purpose. Right. It was what made Redress work.
And at the same time, you were also talking about the idea of compensation. So you had this going on, and you had the whole idea of compensation, which, as you said in the book, you don't talk about that kind of thing in the JA community or Japanese community. Money is kind of taboo. So how did you juggle that conversation as well?
Well, people forget that the majority of Japanese Americans were opposed to redress when we started this public campaign. Even within the JSL, it was very split between those. And the thing is, the leadership of the JSL, the elder Nisei, the majority were against it because culturally, we don't do this kind of thing. We don't, in those days, if you were Japanese, you didn't take anyone to court, no matter how badly you might have gotten screwed, because this was not the Japanese way. Everything was gaman and shikatakana. And there are all these cultural inhibitions against doing something like this. I realized the only thing that would resonate for the Nisei, and the Nisei were critical to everything we did, was to talk about this as a constitutional issue, to say, this isn't about us. This isn't about our pain, our personal damage, whatever happened to us. This is about the country, and this is about what we can contribute to make this a better country. And this is about the Constitution. In that framework, the Nisei understood this as a very different kind of issue. And a key point was in 1979, the JSL California chapters, they call it a tri-district, 3 districts of California, which comprise 75% of the JSL membership. had a meeting in Fresno. And it was at that meeting that the Central California District switched from opposing redress to supporting it. And they did it because of that message that this is really not about you. It's about the country. It's about the Constitution. And they changed their position, and it changed the entire face of the campaign for the JACL. And, that spilled out into the community. There was still a lot of opposition to the JACL, a lot of opposition to the choices we made, like the strategy for a commission, and just our position on this. People would say, how dare the JACL think they can lead this campaign? It's just
Right.
the way things were.
Right. So you had you established the commission. What year was the commission established, and then how many years did it take to see some movement?
Well, what was interesting, it was a very fast bill. You don't ever see this in the Congress. We had that meeting with the 4 members of Japanese American members of Congress at the end of January 1979. And by midsummer, we had bills drafted and introduced by September to
That's
establish
fast.
this commission. But, in the meantime, I was in DC lobbying members of Congress. Mineta and Matsui were out there working the House, and we had a Washington rep who was also doing work on this. So it wasn't like we were just standing still waiting. We were already lobbying to get votes for this commission bill. The bill was introduced in September of 1979. In end of July 1980, President Jimmy Carter signed the commission bill. And so the whole strategy was, okay, we get this commission established. Jimmy Carter wins re-election, has another 4 years. In the meantime, we'll get a money bill introduced, and we'll get that passed and get it to Carter's desk. He'll sign the reparations bill, except he lost re-election. And Ronald Reagan was elected, and everyone thought, oh my God, this guy is conservative, he's reactionary. But the thing about Reagan that we forgot about is he knew Japanese Americans. He had spent much of his life in California, and he had friends, close friends, who were Japanese American, and that was what we relied on.
Right, and you had some interesting anecdotes in the book about going in to talk to President Carter, and his not quite grasping the fact that the Japanese Americans in front of him were actually Americans, and could they speak English, and but how interesting that it that he signed, but then also that Reagan was eventually in your corner as well.
Yeah, and what was interesting is Dan Inoue influenced Carter enormously. Carter had breakfast with Inoue every Wednesday morning at the White House. And so he knew Inoue well. And Inoue was able to influence Carter's thinking about basically the Asia foreign diplomatic scene, but also about Japanese Americans as separate from that. And he was pretty much influential in the White House with Carter. When Ronald Reagan became president, we lost that contact. Here he was, a conservative Republican, and Inoue and Matsunaga and Mineta were seen as very liberal Democrats. And so there was this big separation. We got the bill through the House and the Senate. It passed the Congress and went to the president's desk. And there was this whole question of would he sign it or not, because some people are saying he's not going to. And over a period of time, it finally evolved to the point that Reagan signed the bill and apparently had never said he wasn't going to sign it. It was his staff that was opposed to it for really bizarre reasons, foreign relations and stuff that wasn't even relevant to it. But Reagan had, there were calls made to the White House from just about every Republican Japanese American we could find um, to call Reagan. And I knew someone here where I live, in the area I live in, who was a personal friend of Reagan's, who did make a call and told me, well, he says he's going to sign it. Why are you guys worried? But there was this concern because the staff was influencing, so it seems, his thinking. But, we had some very influential and very important Japanese Americans who were very strong Republicans and tied to Reagan, making those calls. And in the end, he signed the bill in August of 1988. What was amazing, it was the only time this country has ever paid reparations to a group of American citizens who lost their rights. What was interesting for me is at the very beginning of this whole effort, when I got involved and I started climbing the JACL ladder up to the national level, people would say to me, don't get involved. This is a dead issue. There's no way you can pass this. And then as I started looking at the national scene, I consulted with a few people who said that it's deadly if you lead this campaign. It's doomed to failure. It's impossible. And the only reason no one's tried it is because you can't do it. And so there wasn't a chance in hell to get this passed. But, we just felt that it was important for us to try. And we succeeded.
Yes, you did. And but for so much of this time, you were commuting from California to Washington, D.C. You were still teaching. You had a family. There was a lot of personal sacrifice that you and I'm sure others as well gave up. But I mean, just reading about your schedule, to talk about that and talk about the support of your family.
Well, when I first started going to Washington, I was still teaching. I had a teaching position at City College San Francisco. And at the college level, you have some flexibility, not, unlike high school teachers, for example. And I had really good friends in my department who would cover my classes when I needed to go to Washington. So I was going to DC at every chance I could go to lobby for this commission bill. And once the bill passed, the commission hearings were held, and we were approaching what looked like a possibility of success. We were at a critical juncture, and I decided I needed to do this. I needed to make a decision. And I had resigned my tenure to work full-time with the JSL, and the position I had applied for, I didn't get, but I was hired to work full-time as the Redress lobbyist for JSL. So then I moved to DC. My family, Carol, my wife and I talked about, should we move as a family? I just didn't feel DC was a great place for kids. I mean, there's a lot of history there. You could go to museums, but at a certain point, you're a family that lives in a city where families don't always thrive. And so we made a decision that it was better for our kids to grow up here in California. And I moved to DC on my own and flew back and forth to visit my family. But my focus was in Washington. But I got used to the rhythm of the Congress, long recesses where I could leave and come back. And it reached a point where I felt like I needed to be with my family more. I needed to reverse the schedule. So I moved back to California and would fly to DC and stay there while the Congress was in session, and then come back to be back with my family. It was trying, but I couldn't have done it without my wife agreeing to what I was doing. I mean, she understood how important this was, that this was, for us, this was monumental, as a community. And I don't know if I told you this, but throughout the whole 10 years of my involvement with it, she never complained to me about how much I was gone. And, you know, I think about that now. I never would have been able to stay with it had there been any conflict that way. But a lot of people put in a lot of time working on this and, you know, made a lot of sacrifices. But it was something that was important to do.
Yeah. So then the bill was signed in 1988, but you had stepped away from all of this in 86, correct? So you weren't there for the bill signing. You were with
Well, you know,
family.
the reason I left is we had a huge internal fight in the JSL. It was over control of the redress campaign and, you know, different ideas, different philosophies of what had to be done. And I, you know, because I was the center of the conflict, I decided it's time for me to move on. But you know, I was in DC and I looked at where we were, how many votes we had, where it was going. I was pretty confident we were going to win this fight, but I wasn't there for the last 2 years. And in fact, on the day that Reagan signed the bill, I was on vacation with my family. And I talk about this in my book, how we were up in the Northwest and we're at my brother-in-law's place. And he said, "You have a phone call." Nobody knew I was up there. He said, "You have a phone call." And he says, "It's Senator Inoue." So I talked to Inoue, who said, "I want you to get on a plane and come for the signing. It's going to be tomorrow." And I said, "You know, Senator, I've done this too many times to my family. I'm not doing it. I don't need to be there." And we had this conversation. And before I hung up, I said, "By the way, how do you know I'm here?" And I said, "Because I haven't told anybody." He said, "You forget, I was the chairman of the CIA Oversight Committee. You could be on the moon and I'd find you." And I thought, this is typical Danny Noe. And the next day we were in Oregon driving back to California when we heard it on the radio that Reagan had signed. And, you know, it was a nice end to the campaign.
How did you feel? What feelings rushed through you?
You know, by then I was separated from the JSA. I was still going to DC, and whenever I was there, I would lobby the bill. I still felt a connection to it, but I didn't feel the pressures that I had before. But it was interesting because when I heard it on the radio, it was the sense of letting it go. You know, finally, we can let this whole thing go. And it was like, it was the pressure of it all over all the years. It just sort of lifted. Although I sense that more in retrospect than at the moment. Because, you know, we had the kids in the car and we're driving long distance and all of that. And, but it was, I remember a sense of real relief that I can finally let this go. It's done.
What a freeing feeling that must have been, but also to look back and look what you did and what foundation was established. I mean, fast forward to 9/11 and your efforts there, and even looking forward to, you know, things that we're encountering today. Can you just, you know, speak a little bit to that?
You know, what was interesting about 9/11, right after it happened, the JSL, we mobilized all our chapters to protect Arab and Muslim communities, any communities that were vulnerable, that were going to experience the backlash. I mean, you know, as Japanese Americans of any group in the country, we understood what would happen and why we needed to support those who were going to be attacked. And I started doing the media circuit. My favorite medium always was the 3-hour telephone call-in programs because you get a lot of discussion. What was interesting during Redress was that people would call in and say, "Well, you know, you guys bombed Pearl Harbor and you're brutalizing the Philippines and in the Philippines and all these things that we were doing, that we were responsible for. And plus, you know, your cars are destroying our economy," all of that. And I would explain why all of that was untrue and what the real facts were. And, you know, it was always about, we're not Japan. I mean, Japanese Americans are Americans. We're American citizens. That whole argument, after 9/11, I went on the circuit again, and what I would talk about what happened to us, and that, you know, there was no basis for it other than rumors and racism. And this is exactly what's happening now. There invariably, I found there would be a call. And interesting, most of the time it was a woman who would call and say, you know, wait a minute, we did this to Japanese Americans in World War II, and this commission found that it was unwarranted. There was no evidence of any wrongdoing. We can't do this again. And I felt that that was really important, because the education part of our campaign was really important for building a future in this country. You know, if we had just gone after the money and got the money, who would remember? Some would, with resentment. You know, after all, they bombed Pearl Harbor and we gave them 20,000. But understanding the broader scope of this whole story played an important role in the post 9/11 period, where people understood intelligently why it was wrong to talk like this, why it was wrong in 1942 and with the Redress campaign, and why now after 9/11 we actually should be smarter, we should be wiser. So, you know, I feel like we played a role. We helped whatever we were doing. We filed lawsuit after lawsuit against the Bush administration. And, you know, sort of interesting, I never had a conversation with Norm Mineta, who was in the administration as a cabinet member. But people ask me, who was the most important person? I always say Norm Mineta after 9/11, because he told Bush about his experience as an 11-year-old kid, what happened to him, which convinced Bush that as long as he's president, this would never happen again. And so, you know, it's a combination of a lot of things. You know, a lot of Japanese Americans got involved after 9/11. The JSL had the vehicle and the structure to be able to do what we did.
Yeah. There are so many stories in your book just about your personal relationships with individuals that I just encourage everyone to get the book and read it. But as we are closing down our hour, I just wanted to have you talk a little bit about Mike Masaoka. I know that he has always been a very controversial figure. I know that there are people on this call who, or to say the least, were not fans of his. But you talk about him in the book, and you really make him human. And he actually did play a small role in Redress and all of that. And not to say that you were friends, but you were friendly with one another. Is there anything you can just touch upon on Mike? Because I think we always see him in just one way. And after reading your book, I kind of saw another side.
I've always felt, from the time I got to know Mike during the Redress campaign, I felt that he was like a Shakespearean tragic figure. He did things in his view and the view of the JSL, for the right reasons. But some of the decisions to try to achieve that were horrible, like telling the community to cooperate with the government and go quietly into the camps. Well, that was really a bad decision, but it was done to show this country that, in fact, Japanese Americans are very loyal, extreme loyal, to the point that we would go without complaining. The other side of that, though, is that Japanese Americans, whether they agreed with the JSL or not, went anyway. You know, it wasn't like the JSL changed anyone's mind, because at that point, the JSL was still a young organization, didn't have a lot of respect in the community. And, you know, this was shikata kanai. The government was ordering us to be in prison. And although we didn't understand that at the time, but Mike, I think that was an example of why he believed so much in his Americanness and doing things to express it as a Nisei to find greater acceptance in America for all Japanese Americans. But the decision was, it was the wrong decision, done for the right reason, but the reason in retrospect, you take it out of the context of when it was, and he's condemned for that. There were a lot of things Mike did that were very similar. Mike really yearned to be accepted by the community, I think. I heard that in him in so many different ways of wanting to be part of all of this. I think he felt a bit cheated by Redress for not having a central role. But I will tell you, he was the man behind the curtain. There were a lot of strings being pulled, and I knew it. I could tell something was happening. And Masaoka was behind a lot of it. Mike has to be given some credit. I don't know what it is. I could not define for you exactly what Mike contributed. But I do know he talked to some members of Congress that he was pushing Inoue and Mineta in certain directions, which is not to say they're easily pushed, but, it was an important time for him to be part of it, and his day had passed. And in some ways, it was tragic for him.
Yes. We have a couple comments that have come in. Just thank you for writing the book. Thank you for what you've contributed. What's next? What are you working on now?
Well, I'm involved. What's interesting is the book has morphed into something other than what I intended. And it's caught the interest of some of the leadership of the Black reparations movement. And I've been involved in some discussions with Black leaders about reparations and how our strategy, which never seemed to have relevance for a Black reparations movement, suddenly is being looked at very carefully. I haven't specifically gotten involved in the movement itself, but I'm in discussions with different people. And what they always ask about is how those decisions were made and where do you take it from one step to the next. In fact, I have another discussion next week with one of the, I think what I consider one of the intellectual thinkers of this whole process. And, that's keeping me busy. Other than that, I'm a retired guy.
Well, you deserve it. You certainly have done a lot for our nation, and
well, thank you.
Yeah, we thank you. I'm going to come back to you in just a few minutes to give some parting wisdom, some parting thoughts. But to everyone else who's on the call, we just want to say thank you once again for joining our afternoon with the author. We encourage you to go check out our website at nvmc.org to sign up for future talks. This month, at the end of the month on the 27th, for our Nisei narrative, we have Anne and Lori Teranishi. They're going to be doing a presentation, 4 Generations, 2 Sisters, 1 Dream. That's on the 27th at 4 p.m. And then next month's afternoon with the author will be on May 15th, and we're going to invite former Governor George Ariyoshi on to speak about his new book, Hawaii's Future. And then we round out the month of May, again with the Nisei narrative with Mr. Paul Kosasa, the CEO of the ABC stores, and he's going to be talking about business and philanthropy and his family's time in Tule Lake internment camp. But again, we just encourage all of you to check out the website and be part of our NVMC Ohana. We love hearing from you, and we love the fact that you engage with us. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, John, for some final thoughts.
I just have very few things to say. Mainly that the Redress campaign was a remarkable, totally unexpected event in this country. And in some ways, it's very appropriate that it was Japanese Americans who pushed this really unique campaign through. It was a Nisei effort. Some of us who are Sansei were in a position to help lead it, but it was really the Nisei who contributed to whatever this campaign turned into. And it's a story it's a really pretty remarkable story. I feel privileged to have been part of it. And also privileged to be here with you today, Deidre. Thank you. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. The pleasure is all ours. Really have enjoyed our time together. And for those of you who don't have the book yet, we do have a few signed copies still at the center, and it's an amazing book, and one that you definitely have to read. So again, Mr. John Tateishi, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And aloha to everybody. Until next time, ahui ho.